March 1965, George Harrison, his girlfriend Pattie Boyd, John Lennon and his wife Cynthia were invited to the house of their dentist John Riley for dinner. After they'd eaten, when the coffee came out at the end, their host dropped in a sugar cube into each of their cups. And then, all of a sudden, they felt like they were trapped in a horror film. They were all terrified and desperate to leave, but their host wouldn't let them. When they finally got into George's Mini, John Riley pursued them in a taxi before eventually losing them. And during their escape, they were each going mad. Pattie wanted to smash all the windows on Regent Street, John was crying and banging his head against the wall, and Cynthia was trying to make herself sick but ultimately couldn't. It was a living nightmare, and none of them got over it for 3 days. That was the day the Beatles first took LSD. George and John's memory of the night is slightly different. George said that once he'd settled down, I had such an overwhelming feeling of well-being that there was a God, and I could see him in every blade of grass. It was like gaining 100 years of experience in 12 hours. And John said, God, it was just terrifying, but it was fantastic.
When we took the notorious wonder drug LSD, it was, we didn't know we were having it. John and I had this drug. We were having dinner with our dentist. He put it in our coffee and never told us. And we never heard of it. I mean, it's a good job we hadn't heard of it because there's been so much paranoia created around the drug that people now, if they take it, they're already on a bad trip before they start. Whereas for us, we didn't know anything. We were so naive.
Look, the Beatles had always been drug users, and the story goes that Bob Dylan introduced them to marijuana in a hotel room in August of 1964. And the combination of the drug and Bob Dylan's music led to their most out there album yet, and often thought of as the start of the Beatles' most creative period, Rubber Soul. To many, it had seemed like the Beatles had come out of nowhere to an immediately huge audience. But by 1965, things were starting to change. The 60s that we all know and think of really began in that year. See, bands like the Rolling Stones were pushing boundaries, releasing songs like Satisfaction and Get Off My Cloud, which are kind of a step up. And their American counterparts were starting to emerge in the form of the Beach Boys and the Byrds, each desperate to seize back that American audience. So in order for them to remain at the toppermost of the poppermost, they knew they needed to start pushing some boundaries. And where better to start thinking different than with a drug like LSD? After their eventful first trip, George and John fancied giving it another go. So they took the opportunity during a 5-day break in their summer of 1965 North American tour at a house that they were renting from actress Zsa Gabor in Beverly Hills. John and I decided that Paul and Ringo had to have acid, George said, because we couldn't relate to them anymore. Not just on the one level, we couldn't relate to them on any level because acid had changed us so much. It was such a mammoth experience that it was unexplainable. It was something that had to be experienced because you could spend the rest of your life trying to explain what it made you feel and think. It was all too important to John and me. So Ringo joined in. I'd take anything, he later said. It was a fabulous day. The night wasn't so great because it felt like it was never going to wear off. 12 hours later, and it was, give us a break now, Lord. Paul didn't fancy giving it a go that night, and George and John never forgot that. You see, their bond was only growing stronger because of it. After taking acid together, John and I had a very interesting relationship, George later said. John and I spent a lot of time together from then on, and I felt closer to him than all the others, right through until his death. As Yoko came into the picture, I lost a lot of the personal contact with John. But on the odd occasion that I did see him, just by the look in his eyes, I felt we were connected. It's at this point in my research where I'm starting to think, is this the first ever true divide of the Beatles? Is this kind of where it began? The first signs of separation within them? That maybe it was all due to Paul being a little afraid of LSD and not being so open-minded like George and John. Now at the time, there wasn't much of an LSD subculture in Britain. Well, at least compared to America. You see, in the early 1960s, LSD moved from lab experiments into the heart of American counterculture, thanks to two main figures, Ken Kesey and Timothy Leary. You might recognise Kesey as either the author of One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest or the central figure in Tom Wolfe's book, The Electric Kool-Aid Acid Test. It's one of my favourite books of all time. Kesey first encountered LSD in 1961 while volunteering for government drug trials at Stanford. Captivated by its effects, he began sharing it with his friends, and by 1965 launched the famous acid tests. These chaotic gatherings featured music from the Grateful Dead, insane, wacky strobe lights, and Kesey's gang, which were called the Merry Pranksters. They together turned LSD into a communal West Coast phenomenon. They would ride up and down in their psychedelic bus, sharing the love, spreading the gospel of a higher plane of living through LSD. On the East Coast, however, Harvard psychologist Timothy Leary started his LSD research in 1960, believing that the drug could expand consciousness and transform society. By 1963, after some controversial experiments with students, he was actually dismissed from Harvard, but that made him become an even more louder advocate once he left Harvard. Kesey's parties, mixed with Leary's preachings, together pushed LSD from secret experiments into the mainstream culture, helping to define the psychedelic revolution of the 1960s, well, before the government crackdowns made the drug illegal in 1968. And it's with Leary's book, The Psychedelic Experience, that I want to focus on. So for a rookie like John, an acid trip was a completely unnavigatable experience. And after taking LSD for the third time in January 1966, John was desperate to have some sort of grasp of what was happening when he took the drug. The root of Leary's teachings are about the drug's effects in shattering the ego, allowing you to become separate from your mind and body. But by destroying your ego, you are undoing all the deep-rooted teachings that have managed your whole life, thus allowing you to become free of suffering and to see life as a kind of a game. And if you like this, you are more likely, well, in Leary's view, to live a peaceful life. Kind of like a hippie. And with a nation of people living like this, there could be a new revolution in the way that humans lived. Well, at least that's what he thought. However, naturally, as thousands of Leary disciples tried to adopt this lifestyle in the mid to late 60s, this led to uncharted amounts of young, and I guess old people, unable to fully function in the real world. Though according to Leary, the real world is nothing more than an illusion. So what do I know? To be honest with you, as I read more about Leary's teachings, I have to say I am quite interested. I'm not sure I could ever imagine taking LSD myself, but it's downright interesting. Maybe a video on this in the future. Let me know what you think in the comments. So Lennon began to read Leary's book, The Psychedelic Experience, and began reading back its instructions, some of which were paraphrases from the ancient Tibetan Book of the Dead. As the drug took effect whilst he was doing this, he was desperate to make a song that captured this mood. He first called the demo The Void at first, before it was retitled to Tomorrow Never Knows, which is potentially one of the most influential Beatles records of all time. While we know now that Lennon was lucky to escape becoming a real victim of the drug, he did admit that it did mellow him out, as he was often known for having a harsh temper when he was younger. By his account, he was taking LSD daily, and for the next 2 years, between 1966 and 1968, he had little grasp of his identity. But it's also worth noting that the drug also hugely contributed to some of the surreal imagery in his lyrics, for which he's very famous for. Songs like Strawberry Fields, I Am the Walrus, Day in the Life. But despite how amazing some of these songs are, it did come at a cost to his general creativity. Songs didn't flow out of him like they used to. In the book, Paul and John, A Love Story in Songs, author Ian Leslie notes that he never found it so hard to create new songs. Only 4 songs came from him for Sgt. Pepper's, and Paul had to pull them out of him. During the recording of the song Getting Better, Lennon accidentally took a tab of acid as they were getting ready to record. John went up to the roof for some fresh air as he was feeling a bit funny, and then the rest of the band, upon realising that he was on acid, rushed up to make sure that nothing bad happened. Paul then took John home to his Regency townhouse, and it was there that John urged Paul to join him on his acid trip. I was really frightened of the stuff, Paul said in Anthology. When acid came around, we'd heard You're Never the Same. It alters your life and you're never the same again. I think John was rather excited by that prospect, so I was seen to stall a little bit within the group. That night, John and Paul did something that the two of them practiced quite a few times during this period. They just gazed intensely into each other's eyes, Leslie wrote. Wow. Now, the Beatles weren't the only band trying to make LSD music. Revolver is a landmark album in terms of an album inspired by a drug, but the Beatles did do it a little bit differently, and especially nailed it with the song Tomorrow Never Knows. Bands like Pink Floyd, Jefferson Airplane, Grateful Dead, maybe even The Doors too, were trying to recreate that transcendent feeling of being on LSD through music. But the Beatles just did it so much better. The Beatles were a lot more skilled in the studio and in their songwriting, so their music didn't need to be drowned in druggy psychedelic effects. They could still keep a strong melody at the core. Tomorrow Never Knows, the first song written for Revolver and the first Beatles song written on LSD, set the tone for the rest of the record. And what a record it is. A year later, in 1967, around the release of Sgt. Pepper's, Paul McCartney, the nice, cute Beatle, admitted to having his eyes opened by LSD. We only use 1/10 of our brains. Just think what we'd accomplish if we could tap that hidden part. And when speaking about its effects on the band, it started to find its way into everything we did really. It coloured our perceptions. I think we started to realise there wasn't as many frontiers as we thought there were, and we realised we could break barriers. When Paul declared to the world that he'd taken LSD, which was a bit of a strange admittance because he'd done it nowhere near as much as George or John, anyway, the world went crazy. The Daily Mail outright called him an irresponsible idiot. And I think it kind of makes sense because back then, Paul was the ambassador for the Beatles. The one that you wouldn't mind your daughter going out with.
Paul, how often have you taken LSD?
About 4 times.
And where did you get it from?
So, I mean, if I was to say where I got it from, it's illegal and everything, it's silly to say that, so I'd rather not say that.
Don't you believe that this was a matter which you should have kept private?
But the thing is, that I was asked a question by a newspaper, and the decision was whether to tell a lie or to tell him the truth, I decided to tell him the truth. But I really didn't want to say anything, because if I'd had my decision, if I had it my way, I wouldn't have told anyone, because I'm not trying to spread the word about this. But the man from the newspaper is the man from the mass medium, I'll keep it a personal thing. If he does too, if he keeps it quiet. But he wanted to spread it, so it's his responsibility, for spreading it, not mine.
But you're a public figure, and you said it in the first place, and you must have known that it would have made the newspapers.
Yes, but to say it, is only to tell the truth. I'm telling the truth, I don't know what everyone's so angry about.
Well, do you think you have now encouraged your fans to take drugs?
I don't think it'll make any difference, I don't think my fans are going to take drugs just because I did, But the thing is, that's not the point anyway, I was asked whether I had or not. And then from then on, the whole bit about how far it's going to go and how many people it's going to encourage is up to the newspapers and up to you, on television. I mean, you're spreading this now at this moment. This is going into all the homes, in Britain. And I'd rather it didn't, But you're asking me the question. You want me to be honest. I'll be honest,
But as a public figure, surely you've got a responsibility to lots and
No,
lots
it's
of
you've
teenagers.
got the responsibility. You've got the responsibility not to spread this now. I'm quite prepared to keep it as a very personal thing, if you will too. If you'll shut up about it, I will.
Elvis Presley, Paul's idol, looked in horror at the drug counterculture that was taking place all over the world, and even begged Nixon never to let the Beatles into the country again. Soon after this outcry, the Beatles decided to stop. John followed a little after the rest of them. One night in 1968, he had a mad trip and declared himself Jesus Christ and urged them all to send a press release out about it. You see, I'm not really sure how that would have gone down. In the end, LSD didn't just give the Beatles a few trippy nights out and some funny memories. It completely reshaped who they were as artists and people. It opened doors they didn't even know existed, pulling their music away from pop love songs, the I Wanna Hold Your Hands of the world, and the folk rock sound of the Birds, the Norwegian Woods, what have you, and into whole new worlds of sound and imagination. Tomorrow Never Knows, Sgt. Pepper's, Strawberry Fields, all of those classics trace back to that first sugar cube in that dentist's house. Sure, the drug came with its dark side. straining relationships, and leaving John especially lost for a while. But without LSD, the Beatles might never have pushed boundaries the way that they did, and the 60s themselves might not sound the same. At the end of the day, everybody was giving it a go. It was a time for experimentation, to try new things. It didn't ultimately lead to the revolution Timothy Leary thought it would, but oh well. We got some good tunes out of it. It was the spark that changed everything for better and for worse, and it left the Beatles and music history forever altered. Thanks for watching, all you rock and rollers. As always, don't forget to drop a like on this video if you're into rock and roll. There doesn't seem to be many of us left out there, so let's all stick together, do you know what I mean? And while you're at it, what's your favourite LSD inspired song for the Beatles? I'll kickstart this discussion. Mine is She Said, She Said. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and I will see you all in the next one.